According to estimates by the United Nations, more than 28 million people in East Africa today desperately need immediate food aid. 3 countries in the region face emergency-level food aid needs: Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. Meanwhile, areas of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda also face crisis-level hunger, with some households already in emergency conditions. In Somalia, at least 6.2 million people need food assistance, and that's more than half that country's population. In South Sudan, nearly 2/3 of the population requires assistance, and in fact, about 4.9 million South Sudanese, or about 40% of the population, face severe, life-threatening hunger, with that number expected to rise to 5.5 million by July. In Sudan, if you have to excuse me, I've had laryngitis for the last few days. In Sudan, more than 5.8 million Sudanese are believed to require assistance, 3.3 million of them in still embattled Darfur provinces. Unfortunately, the devastating impact of the current famine isn't confined to the hardest hit drought areas. Uganda itself, struggling with the effects of drought in some areas, has had to contend with nearly 800,000 refugees from South Sudan. By the beginning of this month, as many as 3,000 South Sudanese a week crossed the border into Uganda. Lest we get caught up in the huge numbers involved in this crisis, we must always keep in mind what those numbers actually mean for the people in the long term, as well as the immediate and short term. According to the UN Food Program, World Food Program, calculations in January, global acute malnutrition rates for Somali children and pregnant and lactating women entering Ethiopia reached a whopping 78%. That means that Somali children in the womb won't have enough nourishment to complete their growth in utero. Most, if not all, will be born stunted, which will be made worse by their continuing lack of nutrition once born. Their mothers will be severely weakened. They may not survive childbirth. All of them will have damaged immune systems and will be susceptible to diseases such as cholera or acute diarrhea and may die a preventable death. In any event, the futures of far too many children and their potential contributions to their society will be forever limited, as stunting cannot be reversed. In 2011, the first UN declared drought since the 1980s occurred in East Africa, directly affecting more than 10 million people. This subcommittee held a hearing on the crisis on September 28th of that year and worked with humanitarian groups to ensure that aid was available and provided in the most in-need areas of East Africa. We will follow this hearing with a similar effort. 6 years ago, there was great attention given to the famine then. It was an emergency that caught the world's attention. Somehow, the current famine has been caught up in the numerous global crises we face today and is not as much in the news as it ought to have been, and it is one of the largest crises we faced in recent years. In 2011, we struggled with how to get humanitarian aid to those in Somalia who lived in areas controlled by al-Shabaab. That problem has not been eliminated 6 years later. In 2017, not only is the ongoing conflict in Somalia hampering humanitarian efforts there, but the continuing civil conflict in South Sudan has amplified the impact of the drought. In 2015, a congressional staff delegation visited the equatorial provinces of that country, which still produced food, even though poor transportation prevented it from being distributed beyond the borders of that region. There was no conflict there at the time, only internally displaced people. Now all 3 Ecuadorian provinces are seeing a spreading conflict, and with farmers unable to plant or to harvest, the lack of food will only worsen over time. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has accused South Sudan's government of ignoring the plight of its own citizens struggling through the famine. He accused that government's leadership of a refusal to even acknowledge the crisis or fulfill its responsibilities to end it. In a time in which access to food is so critical in South Sudan, militias in that country, supported by both the government and the rebels, have been accused of intentionally destroying crops, looting cattle, and damaging vital water supplies. In July of last year, it is believed that government soldiers were responsible for looting 1.5 million metric tons of food from the World Food Program's warehouse in the capital city of Juba. Matter of fact, Greg Simpkins and I traveled to South Sudan last August We went to Juba and we raised all of these issues, starting with Salva Kiir, to the defense minister, to the head of the UN mission, and many others, including Catholic bishops and others, trying to underscore our concern about food insecurity, the violence that was escalating, because were in a place where just about a month before that, about 200 soldiers had killed each other from two warring factions inside, right at the presidential palace. It was absurd, and we did raise the concerns of our colleagues, our speaker, and the president, but not much has happened in response, sadly. The conflicts in Somalia and South Sudan affect the entire region and place added burdens on their neighbors, who must also cope with the recurring drought. These two countries, along with Eritrea, remain the largest source of refugees globally. We cannot control the weather patterns that lead to recurring droughts in East Africa, but we must find a way to end the conflicts in those two nations so that man-made disasters don't outstrip the impact of nature itself. I'll never forget how the famine in Ethiopia during the Mengistu regime was made all the worse because he used food as a weapon. We can't see a replay of that atrocity today. The term famine, like the term genocide, should not be used lightly. To be considered a famine, there must be an extreme lack of food in at least 20% of the households in any area. Acute malnourishment must affect 30% of children, and a crude death rate of more than 2 deaths per 10,000 must exist daily in the affected areas. As our witness will describe for us today, the situation is already or soon will be in the state of famine in areas of East Africa. Our mission today is to better understand the parameters of the crisis, its causative factors, and the most effective action that must be taken now to save lives and end the threat of an even greater casualty count. So I want to thank again our witnesses and begin the witness testimony with Mr. Matthew Nims, who has more than 17 years of international development and emergency programming experience. He has been with USAID since the year 2000 and has worked in Indonesia, Guyana, Afghanistan, and here in Washington. Starting in August of 2011, he began serving as the Deputy Director of the Office for Food for Peace, and since January 2017, has been the Acting Director of the Office. With a $2 billion a year budget, Food for Peace is the U.S. government's lead for addressing food insecurity worldwide in both emergency and development situations. Mr. Nims, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, esteemed staff, thank you for the invitation to come speak with you today about the food security situation in East Africa, especially the threat of famine in Somalia. Thank you for drawing attention to the plight of the world's vulnerable people and your long history of support for humanitarian efforts. This year, massive humanitarian crises are occurring around the world, demanding an immediate, substantial, and creative response. Our famine early warning system, FuseNet, warns that an unprecedented 70 million people will need emergency food assistance this year due to ongoing conflict, severe drought, and economic instability. These crises are largely man-made, with other compounding factors like the drought in Somalia, making the situation even more untenable. East Africa is facing one of the worst droughts ever recorded, and as many as 15 million people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are facing food and water shortages as a result. In many areas, vegetation conditions are the worst on record, and if the rains fail this spring, the situation will continue to deteriorate. We're seeing the worst in Somalia, where the effects of drought are being compounded by insecurity. In 2011, nearly 260,000 Somalis, half of them children under 5, died in a famine triggered by what was, at the time, East Africa's worst drought in 60 years. If current trends continue, famine, a term we do not use lightly, could happen again in Somalia. Already, more than 6 million Somalis, over half the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, and the rate of severe acute malnutrition is rising. The crisis in Somalia also has regional effects as people leave to look for food and support in neighboring countries. This migration, as well as refugees arriving from South Sudan, strains already depleted neighbors Ethiopia and Kenya. But even with these challenges, these governments are proactively responding to the drought, and USAID is aligning its investments with these country-led efforts. USAID has rapidly scaled up and redirected its efforts, providing vital food and malnutrition treatment, as well as safe water, improved sanitation, and hygiene. And even in the midst of an emergency, we look for opportunities to build resilience and strengthen the community's ability to respond to future shocks and stresses. I recently visited a livestock market that is part of these resilience-building activities in the arid lands of northern Kenya. The market, and others like it, support the livelihood activities of the pastoralists in the region, providing livestock trading and veterinarian services, and in turn spawned opportunities for entrepreneurs in the local economy. Jacob, for instance, fixes the motorcycles of people traveling to and from the new markets, and Mercy runs a restaurant to feed traders using locally grown food. These efforts across the region are expanding economic opportunities, strengthening drought cycle management, and improving health and human capital. Over the long term, a British study estimates that every dollar invested in resilience results in nearly $3 in reduced humanitarian spending, avoided loss, and improved well-being. Challenges remain, however. In South Sudan, years of intense violence has transformed the world's youngest nation into one of the most food insecure in the world. Nearly half of South Sudan's population faces life-threatening hunger this year, and famine was declared in several counties just last month. In northeastern Nigeria, more than 5.1 million people are facing severe food insecurity, and nearly 450,000 children will experience life-threatening severe acute malnutrition this year. Famine likely did occur in 2016, but access has made it difficult to confirm. Lastly, I would be remiss not to mention the situation in Yemen, which is experiencing the largest food security emergency in the world. Conflict, political instability, economic crisis, and rising food and fuel prices have left more than 17 million people food insecure. This situation has repercussions in East Africa as refugees flee to Somalia and Djibouti, who are struggling to handle the influx even as they face their own domestic crises. These broader challenges are important to note because we are never focusing on just one country or region at a time. The United States cannot do it alone. We need the United Nations, affected governments, donor partners, and NGOs like the ones that will be testifying after me to work together to tackle these challenges. I want to thank these partners and our staff at USAID for their tireless efforts and dedication to helping those affected around the world. Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your attention to these issues and for congressional support provided to USAID, especially our humanitarian programs over the years. Please know that your support transforms and saves lives every day. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis, for your testimony, and above all, for your work, which has been tremendous over the years. And obviously, during a crisis like this, it's needed now more than ever. Let me just ask you a few questions. One, the cooperation, about a month ago, you had testified that Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia all pledged regional cooperation and cross-border collaboration to tackle the drought and the underlying fragility in the region. Has there been any fruit to that effort? Are they truly cooperating? And are we ahead of the curve this time, or are we just keeping our head afloat, or are we behind?
Thank you for that question. As far as cooperation efforts of those countries that you mentioned, through IFAD, through the IFAD network, they have brought together leaders of those governments to work better together to address this crisis. I think the efforts, most notably in Kenya and Ethiopia, are showing the greatest strides. For example, the same drought that is affecting Somalia is also affecting those two countries. But those two countries are better able to withstand what's happening. Kenya, for example, is putting $1.6 billion of its own resources towards helping people in Kenya that are affected by this drought. Ethiopia has a long-standing program, a social safety net program, in conjunction with USAID and other donors, as well to be able to better withstand what's going on. So the cooperation definitely has started, and IFAD is in a good position to do this.
Let me ask you with regards to aid workers. When Greg Simpkins and I were in Juba, again, late August of last year, we kept raising the issue, including with the military, with 5 of the top generals and the defense minister, about the need. This is after the Tehran incident where several aid workers were raped. Many aid workers were beaten, and diplomats. One journalist, a South Sudanese man, was killed. And as it turned out, one of the aid workers, and I didn't know this until about 3 days before we left, was actually from my district. She was not raped, but she was sexually assaulted. And the 2 military officers that broke in and broke up what was about to become a rape, prevented even further tragedy to her. But she has been severely traumatized. She was actually going to testify at a hearing we had on South Sudan, and then just didn't want to. She was going to do it by way of phone with no name attribution, anonymously, but it was just too much to tell the story of what an aid worker goes through. So my question is, the UN panel of experts for South Sudan said that South Sudan is the deadliest in the world for aid workers. It seems to me that whether it be USAID and our mission leaders and people on the ground, or anyone else from the NGO community, we've got to just keep pounding away with these governments and all parties, including rebels, that leave the aid workers alone. There needs to be a sacrosanctness. It's almost like when the Red Cross would show up, even the most hostile of forces would at least allow the white flag for humanitarian purposes to go forward. What can we do to maybe an initial assessment of how bad it really is in each of these countries, and what can we do to make sure that that aid does then flow? And that will include the indigenous aid workers, because sometimes they're picked off and hurt because they're seen, well, they're South Sudanese and nobody will make a big deal about it. Of course, we look at their lives as equally important to everyone else's life. So if you could speak to that.
Chairman Smith, thank you very much for that question. And it's actually incredibly relevant. We just received reports as of yesterday that now it is 7 workers from an indigenous NGO were killed in South Sudan. 3 Kenyans and I think it's now 4 South Sudanese. They worked for a local NGO. USAID does not have a direct relationship with that entity, but they are definitely partners in trying to bring life-saving aid to South Sudan for the greater humanitarian community. I believe that now, since the conflict began in 2013, that we've had over 70 fatalities of aid workers in South Sudan. It is an incredibly dangerous place to work. And I think you're correct in saying that we have to ensure, all donor governments and all operating partners, that the safety of our people are at utmost concern, and that continue to take measures to ensure when they go out to do this work that they are protected, and that all parties know that these are neutral actors in place. This has been an issue that we're not just seeing in South Sudan, we are seeing other parts of the world as well. Part of the World Humanitarian Summit last summer in Turkey talked about this issue, and it's very concerning for donors, especially for our office, where not only do we have our partners, we also have USAID staff as well into these conditions. And this is one of the great changes I think that we've seen in the last 5 years about the nature of conflict and what we're responding to, is that conflicts are not driven necessarily by the natural disasters that they used to be, they're being driven by conflict. Conflict necessarily puts greater risk on our partners. I also think that the people that will be following me will be able to talk in greater detail about some of the actions they're taking.
Let me just ask you, how much money are we allocating towards this crisis? Is there a low estimate, medium estimate, high estimate? What do you think will really be needed? Will there be a request of Congress for additional funding, or do you have enough that you could either reprogram or you already have in? And secondly, on the issue of pre-positioning, again, just having been in Juba, it was appalling that armed forces would go to a WFP warehouse and pretty much strip it clean of all of the foodstuffs that were there, which were intended for extremely hungry people. Pre-positioning has its, and GAO found that, it does save time. It's there in a way that could be accessed quickly, but it does cost money, and then there's the risk of theft. How do we balance all of that? And the idea of WFP tracking food delivery, are we on top of that with them, to make sure that it gets to where it's supposed to be in a timely fashion to alleviate suffering?
Thank you, Chairman, for those questions. Let's talk about some of the numbers. Right now, since 2016, Food for Peace alone has provided, well, since 15 and now 17, including South Sudan, close to $1 billion of resources have been allocated in food resources to all of those affected countries. And that is primarily from the Office of Food for Peace. Our sister office, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in USAID, also has done over $500 million in conjunction with our funding. So I think that there is a robust response from the United States in these crises, and we can break down by country some of these operations, even by partner at a later date if you would like to.
If you could provide that for the record as quickly as possible, that'd be very
Not a problem. We'll definitely be on that as soon as this hearing ends. As far as pre-positioning, especially in South Sudan, but it really goes for other places that we're working as well. But South Sudan is a little bit particular because of the rains in South Sudan. Our partners and the donors work very, 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 very closely to ensure before the rains hit that food is pre-positioned in warehouses throughout the country that needs to be there so that it can be accessed. Conflict will disrupt that our ability to be able to pre-position those warehouses into those warehouses. The case in Juba you mentioned, WFP in particular took heroic efforts to remove much of the food before the conflict actually began. Not all of the food was taken out, but that warehouse in and of itself, they knew that the conflict actors were coming, and the team moved actually the majority of the food out of that warehouse before the conflict. So our teams on the ground are very adept at being able to know what's going on the ground and protect those resources. There's always a danger in pre-positioning, but because of the access we get when these conditions allow us not able to deliver, having that food in place is of primary importance. So we're going to continue to use that tool to ensure we're best able to respond. Your final question about WFP tracking or being able to account for the resources. This is something of critical importance to USAID in general and definitely our office. We partner with USAID, with WFP and the NGOs to ensure that those that have been targeted are the ones that are receiving the aid. And there's several ways that we do this. First of all is ensuring that those identified are the ones that need the aid. In other words, the most vulnerable are getting it. Our partners are very, very good at ensuring when they go to communities, those relationships that they have, they are able to identify those who are most in need. The second round, when we actually go for distribution, is that we have teams of monitors in place, and we have certain biometric measures that we can employ to ensure that those that have been identified are actually the people that are getting the aid. This can go from a retinal scan to an ID card to even a fingerprint that we would employ to ensure that those people are the ones that are supposed to be getting the aid. And then finally, we would do, especially in places like Somalia and in other places, is a follow-up distribution testing, is a follow-up to ensure that the people have actually received the aid. This can be done through cell phone surveys, similar to our Nielsen ratings that we have here in the United States, where we'll do random call of beneficiaries to ensure that they actually did receive the aid, as well as setting up hotlines so that beneficiaries can actually call in to ensure that they've got that. Finally, what we do is that we, USAID, have employed third-party monitorings. These are actually groups of NGOs or other actors that we employ to go back to those areas to ensure that the food that was allocated to those regions actually was delivered to those people that we're supposed to. This all combines to make sure that we have a pretty good eye on what we plan to do actually happens and reaches those needy beneficiaries.
And before yielding to my good friend and colleague, Ranking Member Bass, one issue that we pressed Salva Kiir on relentlessly, and have done so since our trip there in August, his defense minister, his vice president, who I've seen since, is zero tolerance for sexual violence. Violence of all kinds, but including sexual violence. The report on the Tehran installation suggested that they do that, which is what we were asking for, but it still hasn't happened. And until the military, up and down the command at every aspect of it, realizes that its security forces cannot rape and harass people, particularly aid workers, who are seemingly one of the most targeted groups. We really have to raise the bar, I think. I mean, they've promised they would do it. Kiir told us he would do it, told Greg and I face to face, and it's about time it get done. That was in August. So wherever you can find, and I know you're absolutely on board pushing that, but know that we work in tandem, all of us, it's bipartisan. That has got to end, and they need to implement a strategy that is zero tolerance, because just like we had with many of the peacekeepers when they were deployed to Goma and other places, and I had several hearings there, went there, as you know, I wrote the trafficking laws for the United States, Trafficking Victims Protection Act. George W. Bush did a zero tolerance policy for our military, and it holds today, and if somebody violates it, even to the point of prostitution, the Uniform Code of Military Justice is as clear as a bell. It is actionable, and they can go to prison, and they should go to prison, those who violate it. So, Kiir, we told them that. We said, we know that years back, you had a fondness for President Bush. Well, he did it with our military. Please do it with yours. And he said he would, and he hasn't. So it's a point of great consternation and anger now that they have refused to actually do it. So I just would hope you would convey that too, because again, the people we want to protect are the indigenous South Sudanese, obviously, and the beneficiaries of the aid, and all of those wonderful women and men who put their lives on the line as aid workers to help. So thank you so much for your testimony.